So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We're still missing one of our panelists stuck in traffic, but we will start without, and he will join us as soon as he can. We're here for a panel on protection of civilians and humanitarian CivMil coordination. My name is Rebecca Johnson. I am head of Matiatseri Peace Foundation's Brussels office, and it's an absolute privilege to be here. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us and allowing us to take the stage today. As you probably have seen from the program, the aim of this panel is to increase awareness on the mainstreaming of the protection of civilians by UN and EU peace and security actors, with particular focus on missions and operations. We hope to bring to the fore some best practices and lessons learned on the role of humanitarian CivMil coordination in the protection of civilians. And complementarity between actors is one of our key themes. As throughout this forum, I understand, we will be using Slido and social media. For the people in the room, you're more than welcome to raise your hand and ask questions in person. In fact, that would be quite nice. But if you prefer, then you can, of course, use Slido. And for those online, please also use Slido. Choose the room studio and use the hashtag EHF2023. Same for everyone joining. If you can use the hashtag, that would be great if you are posting on social media. That's all the technicalities. So let's move on to introducing the speakers before I give you a very brief overview of the topic, and then we move straight ahead. First speaker on my list is the one not here. So we have Rory Keane next to me, who is probably many of you in Brussels know, Head of Office for the United Nations Liaison Office for Peace and Security, UNLOPS. Before coming to Brussels, he worked for the UN Special Envoy for the Sahel region and served as the Security Sector Advisor to the UN Special Representative in Liberia. He's also been team leader of the OECD International Network on Conflict and Fragility. He's worked in the European Commission on the DRC and Great Lakes, and he's been the OSCE spokesperson in the former Yugoslavia, so quite a smorgasbord of multilaterals there. He also holds a PhD on EU peace and security policy. With us also we have Edem Wosornou, Chief Response Support Branch Coordination and Division in OCHA. Prior to her current appointment, Ms. Wosornou served as OCHA's Head of Office in Nigeria and as Chief of the Strategy Planning, Evaluation and Guidance Section in the Office of the Assistant Secretary General of OCHA. Before this, she briefly led the political engagement team head ahead of the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit and served as OCHA section chief for Asia and the Pacific region, and the list goes on with different OCHA postings around the globe. So I will limit the list there, but absolutely brilliant to talk to the topic today. And she also has a postgraduate diploma in legal studies. Then we move on to Lieutenant General Cornelis Johannes Matthiessen, who's from the Dutch Army, former MINUSMA force commander. In his 42 years of military service, he has been deployed in Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and most recently in Mali, as I said, commanding one of the UN's biggest missions. He's worked extensively in cooperation with other actors and in leadership position also across multilaterals. Then we have Vianney Bissi-Moi, who is the Regional Director for the Sahel Program in the Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC. He leads efforts to reduce civilians' harm and better protect communities affected by conflict in the Sahel, and previously worked with Search for Common Ground as Country Director in Mali and head of the Goma and Kinshasa offices in the DRC, as well as with the Danish Refugee Council in the Central African Republic. And with Christian Aid in DRC as head of humanitarian and tackling violence and building peace progress. I think I cut a few on the way. I'm sorry, there's a lot of also important positions there, but I'm trying to speed up. So let's get into the topic. And when Cosmin arrives, we'll see if we have time to introduce him as well. So we're living in a turbulent, complex reality where a lot of what we've taken for granted over the last century or so is being seriously challenged. With war on Europe's doorstep, the balance of the international system has been turned on its head. Some say we're turning to the Cold War, others to a new global era era where we hear about minilateralism and multipolarity. What is certain is that multilateralism and the global world order is not in a good place, and that this comes at an increasingly steep price for peace and security, and tragically for humanity. According to the UNHCR, in 2023, 339 people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. It's a 17 increase from last year. It means 1 in every 23 people in the world needs emergency assistance to survive. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed told the UN Security Council in January that the world is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since the World War II. This is at a time when the UN Security Council is very divided and has problems acting on these conflicts. And at the same time, humanitarian aid has to increasingly protect itself from politicization. It's taking a heavy toll on civilians, but also on aid workers. More than 100 million people are currently displaced, humanitarian needs are growing, and development aid is more and more turned into either humanitarian aid or defense spending, and so we're only increasing the international dependencies. In this volatile and sensitive reality, coordination between civilian and military actors has perhaps never been more important, especially when it comes to the protection of civilians. While it's very important to keep a clear distinction between the two, coordination is also key. So what does this mean in practice in order to ensure protection of civilians and withstanding these growing challenges? On both the EU and UN side, we've seen some unprecedented developments over the last few years, including closer cooperation between the two organizations and with civil society actors. But also this cooperation is challenged by the current ongoing geopolitical divides. So to what extent can those past lessons help us address the rapidly growing needs, but also how do we adapt to this current reality? And where does that leave you and I and the protection of civilians in conflict areas? So let us get into the topic with the panelists who have a wealth of experience to share with us. Since Cosmin is not here and he was supposed to go first, we start with Rory Keane. And could you share some of the main lessons learned from the implementation of the UN's approach to the protection of civilians? You have 3 minutes for that first question. You choose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm representing the Department of Peace Operations, which is the department that backstops UN peacekeeping operations that are deployed around the world. And since the first protection of civilians mandated peacekeeping mission, which was in Sierra Leone in 1999, UN peacekeeping has been confronted with a broad range of threats to civilians and increasingly complex operational environments. And what we have been trying to do is to ensure that as the nature of the peacekeeping environment evolves, we have tried to ensure that the POC mandate and the tasks, activities and responsibilities necessary to implement it are updated and that we are learning lessons as we go along. It is true, and I think this is a forum for honest dialogue and honest conversation, where we fail to manage or to meet the high expectations placed on us to protect civilians. We are presented with strategic, operational, and reputational risks. And therefore, we need to be very clear in terms of how we define protection of civilians in a peacekeeping setting, and what the responsibilities are of a peacekeeping mission in that setting, and to communicate what is possible and what is not. The successful implementation of POC mandates requires a multi-dimensional approach based on collaboration and coordination, and also dialogue with humanitarian actors. And I think that's why a forum like this is particularly important, because it allows different policy communities to really think about how we take this agenda forward. And when we in UN peacekeeping think about this agenda, we're really thinking about 3 tiers of activities. I'm not saying that UN peacekeeping takes responsibility or takes the lead, rather, in all of these areas, but we need to think holistically about the 3 areas. One is protection through dialogue and engagement, and that's the one that perhaps doesn't get enough attention, protection through dialogue and engagement. The second is the provision of physical protection, and the third is the establishment of a protective environment. And all of this needs to come together in order to deliver a POC mandate as set out in a UN peacekeeping resolution. Now, the reality and the challenge, and I'm sure the former force commander can give us the detail, but the challenge is that peacekeeping operations cannot protect everyone, everywhere, all of the time. Sounds a little bit like a recent movie. And this is really one of the challenges that we're facing, and our operations must constantly assess the threats to civilians and then prioritize capabilities and resources to prevent and respond effectively. And this is what mission leadership need to do on the ground. The mission also has to take into account the strengths, the remits and the reach of our partners on the ground, including the host government, which has the primary responsibility for protection. So all of these factors need to be taken into consideration. We feel that one of the things that we need to, in terms of learning from past failures, one of the things that we need to put a particular emphasis on is the prevention agenda and the preemption agenda. And this, as I mentioned at the outset, can be supported through political dialogue and engagement and early warning. And in terms of early warning, we think both in terms of low-tech and high-tech, and there's no reason to suggest that high-tech is better than low-tech, but certainly when there is a conflation of both, it can help us. And in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we have engaged a lot in community-based networks, in community outreach, which has supported us in being more aware and having better analysis and being able to preempt in a more effective manner. In the case of Mali, for example, we've also used technology in the form of unmanned aerial vehicles, which has also helped in terms of gathering information to take forward a protection agenda. But these are complex issues, and there's also a political edge to these issues. And for example, in the case of community engagement, we also know that community engagement protection has limitations. And there are instances in which working directly with specific communities or individuals can expose them to additional risks and additional risks and conflict. And therefore, all of our interventions in a peacekeeping setting need to be based on very solid analysis and also very much guided by the principle of do no harm. So my final point, in terms of outlining what we're learning as we go along, is also how we grapple with what's increasingly referred to as Chapter 7.5 missions. And this could be non-UN security forces that have been requested to lead on a security mandate under a UN Security Council resolution. And I think this does pose a challenge that needs to be reflected on by all of us together. And one way that we are doing this in the UN system is to put a huge, strong emphasis on human rights due diligence policy. Not only the policy itself, but the application of the policy. So when non-UN security forces are leading a security effort, it is important that a credible human rights due diligence policy is being implemented as part of that action. In conclusion, very briefly, I wanted to also mention to you that the UN is in the process of developing a new agenda for peace that will set out how we grapple with the challenges of the present and put forward some recommendations in terms of how we move forward on the agenda for peace. Some of you will remember that the last agenda for peace is from 1992, so quite a lot has changed between now and then. And I think when we're thinking about the new agenda for peace, it will also be important to think about how the protection agenda is factored into the discussions on the new agenda for peace. And I would certainly suggest, as we think about the protection of the protection agenda in the context of the new agenda for peace, that we think about issues regarding prevention and engagement with local communities, that we think about analysis, but not only at the country level, but also at the regional level, given the regional dynamic of conflict, that we think better about how we link up early analysis, early warning with early response, and how that works. And in that regard, we also have to have a discussion about capabilities, whether UN peacekeepers have the capabilities they need in order to serve their mandate and in order to implement early action. There's another conference on down the road today regarding security and defense, where issues around capabilities are being looked at. And finally, we need communications. So communications between actors that are involved in protection of civilians, both peacekeeping actors, humanitarian actors, NGOs, civil society, government, local communities, and so on and so forth. And we also need, in terms of communications, need to manage expectations in terms of what is possible and what is not. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rory. You saved yourself a tricky question about the current challenges in the Security Council and lack of Chapter 7 and what that means for protection of civilians, but maybe I'll come back to that. But very important points. I'm very music to my ears to hear prevention and preemption, of course, and the management of expectation is another key aspect. But we have now been joined by also Cosmin Dobran, our last panelist. So everybody else has been introduced. So let me also do that to yourself, and then we'll move on to your comments. Cosmin Dobran is Director of the European External Action Service, the Directorate for Integrated Approach for Security and Peace. He's been there since the 1st of February. And is a former Romanian diplomat with previous postings in Washington, D.C. and Brussels. And he's also worked on a variety of European external action areas, including development, trade, and economic governance, and with European internal policies at the General Secretariat of the European Commission. He studied at the Academy of Economic Studies in Bucharest and in Washington, D.C. Now, let's move on to your remarks. With the significant CSDP developments that we have seen over the last few years, it would be interesting to hear from you a little bit more what this means for the protection of civilians and what this means for civil cooperation in the EU military capacity building and training missions. Over to you, Cosmin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you, and many thanks for inviting me to this event. I apologize for the delay. This is what happens when you try to extract an Eurocrat from the Schuman area, so it's always a challenge, but I'm very glad to be here today. I thought that for the discussion today I would touch upon three main points, a little bit the latest developments regarding the EU military missions and operations. Then I would speak about the integrated approach, which I think is quite relevant for the protection of civilians, but also more general the international humanitarian law. And then a bit of a tool that we are trying to develop, which I also think might be interesting for our discussion. Now, in terms of the key developments on the military side, perhaps there are two major changes that happened compared to the old CSDP. This is how we describe it. So first, now we don't have any military mission operation with an active mandate, an executive mandate in terms of protecting civilians. The majority of the military missions and operations are to increase, basically the objective is to increase capabilities and to train partners in different theaters. This is very important because basically it changes a little bit the framework and the focus of our activities. At the same time, what happens is that we have established new missions. So just to mention Ukraine, the advisory mission in Ukraine, training mission in Mozambique. These are very important missions. So there is a development in that regard. But the general philosophy is now train and equip. This is basically what we have. And obviously we have the missions which were established before, which continued their activities. Now the second major change is the European Peace Facility, which is a game changer in what the EU is doing. Because basically with the EU, with the Peace Facility, now we can actually not only advise and train, but we can also equip partners in different countries. This is very important because actually it has been quite a strong call for complementing a little bit what we do in the military missions and operations with the more concrete support. The instrument basically, which is not a typical instrument based on the European budget, this is financed by member states, but it has a global scope, so basically it can be used in many parts of the world. It has become extremely popular in the context of Ukraine because a lot of resources actually go to support the Ukrainian armed forces. So basically we can say that it works, and obviously we will have to see exactly how this can be developed. Now, moving a little bit closer to the protection of civilian. So basically the international humanitarian law aspect is now at the core of the training activities that we do with the military missions. It's part of the DNA. It's something that we very much insist and work with partners on the ground. So in that respect, we work with different actors on the ground, be it in member states or international organizations, to make sure that this happen. We will have more thematic guidelines which are being developed by the EU military staff. This is something to guide more in details a little bit to the colleagues that are operating in these missions and operations. On the peace facilities side, we have what is called a safeguards and compliance policy. It's a very detailed mechanism to make sure that the support basically does not do harm. It touches a little bit on the all applicable laws, including the humanitarian laws. So this is something which is also taken in the context of the European peace facility. Now, moving a little bit to the EU integrated approach, obviously CSDP missions and operations are only one type of instrument in the panoply of European instruments, and I can only mention the support to civil society organizations and human rights defenders and their capacity basically to monitor the situation and to flag where there is a problem. With respect to missions, I can give a very concrete example in Mali, which is perhaps a little bit interesting because there we had a system where for anti-terrorism operations, we had a force accompanying the operations on the ground to make sure that everything that is done is in line with the applicable laws, including on the humanitarian side, and to make sure that the individuals captured were handed over to the justice in the proper manner. This is a very concrete case. Mali now is a bit difficult because the political and the security situation deteriorated, so the mission is not that active. But it's an interesting example of how this can be done on the ground. Then moving on, obviously we support national justice systems. This is something that we've been doing for many years, so that works very well. On CIF-MIL cooperation, there is always a cooperation with and coordination with DG ECHO. This is something that we do all the time where needed, so there is a system in place. Now a little bit about new tools. So basically what we are working on right now is to put in place a human rights due diligence policy for the support in the security sector. This is basically a methodology of risk management and risk mitigation. It's something that we are working together with the colleagues in the UN because they're much more advanced, but we want to actually have a system in place because we notice that sometimes there are gaps when it comes to the implementation of this policy. And then basically we hope that we would also influence the behavior of national forces on the ground through this mechanism as well. Now, in terms of lessons learned, there are several lessons learned, but perhaps I would focus on one which for me is extremely important, is that we do training, we have the courses, principles, systems that works, but if you don't follow up to see how the implementation actually takes place, you may find yourself in a situation where you would find gaps, not perhaps immediately, but later on. So that's very important from our perspective, and we're trying to strengthen that bit to monitor the actual implementation of what we are doing. I will stop there, and again, many thanks for the invitation, and happy to take any questions, obviously.
Thank you very much, Cosmin. We see many similarities to what Rory was saying. There is a clear focus on early warning, prevent and preempt through the different types of activities that you've mentioned. And it's good to be reminded of the centrality of IHL and also of the do no harm principle, of course. So thank you very much. We now move on to OCHA. And Edem Wosurnu, who maybe you could talk to us a little bit about, with the growing humanitarian needs that we talked about at the outset, where does that put protection of civilian efforts? I guess there are both more demands, but are you also able to address those? And since we've done 2 questions in one, you might as well also then talk to some lessons learned, if you would like, and what the main challenges are today when we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I'll start with just zooming out a bit on our OCHA humanitarian civil military coordination agenda and architecture. And I think Cosmin and Rory have touched on some of the global principles that govern the work that we do. Maybe I'll zoom in on, in addition to global, we have regional practices. I was going on about the importance of regional bodies yesterday on the panel on access, which I cover as well. The global organizations, the regional organizations have played a central role in civil military coordination. The LAS, the African Union, ASEAN, the EU, we work very closely with the EU Civil Protection Team, CEDIMA in the Latin America, Caribbean region as well. I think it's good to highlight some of the key structures at the regional level that support us in our engagement when it comes to humanitarian civil military coordination. You talked about protection of civilians, and there's always that, push and pull between how does a strengthened humanitarian civil military coordination role that OCHA has of course, when we talk about OCHA, of course, we are working with the system, with the humanitarian agencies, with our national NGOs, with our international NGOs, with the private sector, with the militaries, of course, and we look at different perspectives as they come vis-a-vis the new world, the new trends. We see more and more gangs that we work with when it comes to, we're talking about civil military coordination, but the world is changing, and the traditional militaries are not what we see anymore. We're not looking at that. 20, 30 years ago, you had structured militaries, fast forward today, we've got gangs, we've got non-state armed actors. It's just not business as usual. So as OCHA and the system, the IASC system, interagency standing committee, as well as the different structures that we have, we've really had to adapt our practices globally to adjust to the trends and the growing trends. Protection of civilians, when people think about, I remember let me just give a few sort of anecdotes. You talked about the experiences that we have as OCHA in the different contexts that we work. We don't have the luxury to be in very nice places as, I think my fellow panelists, we are in the, context with significant, complex crises settings, or sometimes a natural disaster overlaid on a complex crisis. So it's not always clearly defined. When you're working with humanitarian, when you're working with military actors in a natural disaster setting, it's much easier than when you're working with military actors in a conflict setting. And we've had to constantly adapt our practices. Humanitarian civil military coordination, of course, and Rory touched on many of the points, and I was like, do you have my talking points? Because it's exactly, delivering as one, definitely. Issues of language, issues of, do no harm principles. It's 20 years ago, we spoke a different language, and I think a lot has happened with the different secretariat bodies in the different contexts that we work, where we're speaking very similar language, and that is a real, huge progress. I remember back in the day in Darfur, 2004, sitting there saying, we don't talk to military, we pious humanitarians. We're extremely, holier than thou. We don't talk to you. You're the bad guys with the, sorry, not general, not you, but You're the bad guys with the guns, we don't talk to you, which was the most ridiculous thing that we could possibly do now. 20 years later, we have to be at the same table, having engagements and so on. So fostering dialogue is key, and I'm not going to go through my points because literally, Rory, I have fostering dialogue, I've got, being on the same page, I've got mechanisms, flexibility, constantly adapting our dialogue. So I'm not going to repeat and bore the crowd with what Rory has clearly highlighted. But the links between humanitarian, civil military coordination and protection of civilians. Classic example. You get to a force commander, let me give an example of one of my contacts, Nigeria. You get to a force commander's location, and you're saying that we humanitarians, we're going by the humanitarian principles. We can't talk to you, we can't be escorted by you. Wait, hang on a minute. Didn't you just fly your UNHAS flights into our military zones that are protected to be able to deliver assistance? And yet we're saying, well, we can't talk to you. So that dialogue has changed to, we need to be, you talked about communities, Rory. We need to ensure that we are trying our best to maintain a distinct, footprint, but you flew into our military compound, and you're going to drive out of our military compounds to be able to deliver assistance. So in certain contexts, the principles are really blurred, I would say. I wrote a paper on, the humanitarian principles, not at risk in certain contexts where we work, but humanitarian principles that are, humanitarian space that is constricted, not lost. It's constricted further because some of the principles were never there in the first place. So we have to constantly adapt and watch the blurred lines as we do humanitarian action going forward. Protection of civilians in armed conflict. Who is protecting who? We're talking about communities. We're talking about, you mentioned the 339 million people in need of humanitarian assistance today, 1 in 23 people. Majority of those are women and children. So you go into an armed conflict zone and you're talking to the military and they're like, well, all the men have gone and are fighting against us in a non-state armed group context. So what are you telling us here? There's that constant pushback from the militaries that we work with who are saying that humanitarians, and I think I was in a talk one day where I was asked, are humanitarians facilitating and supporting non-state armed groups? So we face that all the time. I just want to throw those issues on the table and go completely off script because, again, for the third time, Rory stole my points. He said all the things I was going to say, and that shows the excellence with which the UN and our humanitarian system and the political system work. I will not go into the best practices because I have a list of best practices that I want to highlight, hopefully, when we come to round 2. Is that okay? I want to focus on the protection of civilians part. I still have some time.
I think you can do it now because the others have more or less addressed their 2 questions. So-
Okay, all right, then I'll do that. Best practices in different countries and contexts. Number 1, consistency in our dialogue. We always have to talk and push and learn and grow. Again, not at just at the local level, not at capital levels, but also at the regional levels, at the global levels. We have to do that at every single level on coordination with the militaries and armed groups. The second one, again, terminology is key. We have to have the same language and then understand each other's terminology. Another example, I like to bring the sort of field perspective. I was in, with my colleagues in newly liberated areas in Somalia, and we were telling the African Union soldiers who were mixed with the mission, the UN, and it was a hybrid mission. We're telling them that you're not supposed to deliver humanitarian assistance when you liberate a town, because we deliver humanitarian assistance. And the militaries were like, so when we meet a population, what do? Do we not give them our food? We're like, well, that's our job. Yours is QIPs, quick impact projects. They looked at us like, this is ridiculous. So we had to adjust consistently with the terminologies. Rory talked about the UN integrated setting, and Cosmin as well, the integrated approaches. We've gotten integrated assessment policy going for different countries, 24 countries across the globe, on the need to have an integrated approach when it comes to the United Nations system. How do we partner with peacekeeping and political missions in tailored contexts? It's a huge one, and it's best practices. Another best practice that we have with OCHA and the system, and again, I stress that it's not OCHA alone. We work on behalf of the humanitarian community, and it's not just OCHA. Trainings, colleagues have talked about delivering different training programs and tailoring it per region. So how do we train on a context in, let's say, Kenya, where we work with DPPA and DPA in delivering trainings for new force commanders coming through in the colleges as well. How do we deliver trainings in non-state armed group settings is very different from how do we deliver trainings in classic military terms and all of that. The key message when it comes to some of our experiences when it comes to security and political missions is having an operational distinction and strategic engagement. We work with the missions globally, but we have to ensure that we're at the table talking, having constant dialogue. And I think the theme running through the conversation is constant dialogue. I'll stop with the protection of civilians and peace mandate. Protection of civilians for humanitarians is about being closer to the people that we serve. We've often talked about accountability to affected people. We've often talked about the importance of localization, bringing local actors working together as one. And the biggest piece for me over the last 20 years or so, the issue of community acceptance. But then that's the dichotomy I mentioned before. If a community is mainly women and children, most of our HRPs, humanitarian response plans, if you look at the numbers, a lot of women in conflict zones, a lot of women and children. And the biggest point is, where are the men? What are they doing? We don't deal with any of that. We need to ensure that we are consistently staying away and staying neutral. There's a lot I can talk about, but again, it's a good conversation to have when you have different partners working and speaking the same language, the point I started with. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all those concrete and extremely useful insights, and for adjusting so that there's no repetition as well. It's lovely to see how you're both singing from the same song sheet. And there are some more interesting aspects that we could maybe bring out in the discussions as well, where humanitarian actors often now have to step in when there's no political agreement on, for example, peacekeeping, what that means, and also some of the questions that you alluded to about working in contexts where there's ongoing thinking in the development sector about working with the strange states. You're alluding to the same in the sense of working with non-recognized actors and so forth. These are all very important challenges that we're dealing with at the moment. But let's move on to General Mathisen. who will talk to us a little bit about his experience from Mali. It would be great to hear some more about your interaction with the humanitarian community, and also let's merge up the two. Some advice from your side on going forward on EU-UN cooperation, because often also EU aid is delivered with help of UN and so forth, as well as activities. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having the opportunity to be part of this panel, and I also applaud the organization that the theme of protection of civilians is part of the program, because it's an important theme, I think. And if you look at, and a lot has been said already, and if you look at the world that we are living in, and if I refer to Mali, you know, one thing that keeps in my mind is the complexity of the situation, and the complexity of the situation even more, you know, basically demanding, you know, optimizing the cooperation and the coordination amongst all players there. And the MINUSMA mission in Mali does have a POC mandate, which is absolutely necessary. It is good that it is part of the mandate. It's making the mandate robust. On the other hand, and it has been said already, unfortunately, we cannot be everywhere. Mali is a huge country, and where the conflict area is in the northern part of Mali, that's about the size of France. And the complexity of the environment is, well, very hard to understand sometimes, but I'll try to give you in a few sentences a flavor why it is so complex, and why also the word peacekeeping mission, is misleading. Because every day I ask myself the question, what peace, in fact, is there to keep? If you go back to the origin of the MINUSMA mandate, which was basically, you know, following the uprising in the north, basically implementing the peace agreement amongst the three entities that were part of the signing of the peace agreement. If I look at those three, there have not been major clashes since 2012 and 13. That is good news. So in that sense, you could say there's a peace to keep. But the situation has significantly changed. A lot of armed groups, religious motivated, JNIM is one, with a lot of autonomous operating groups in the central part of Mali and in the north of Mali, and even worse, Islamic State in the eastern part of Mali, also in Niger and Burkina Faso, using brutal type of violence. Those actors have taken large parts under their control in Mali. They were never part of the peace agreement. So particularly in those areas, there's no peace really to keep. And the central part of Mali has been added to the mandate in 2019, but no additional resources were provided with that decision. MINUSMA was asked to readjust its resources, you know, to free up resources for the central part of Mali. And the central part of Mali, where 1/3 of the population is living, is a very difficult area where we see many of those armed groups very active. And the population is in between all of that. And the population can never do it right, because if I look at the central parts of Mali, where the Malian armed forces are doing a pretty good and tough job on trying to improve the situation, but they face their limitations as well. And let us be honest, they have the primary responsibility to protect civilians. But they can't be everywhere as well. And wherever they are and wherever they operate, and if the population helps them with information, etc., they face the risk of retaliation by the armed groups. So they're kind of caught up in between. They can never do it right. And once they support the armed groups, well, in the eyes of the Malian armed forces, they're not doing right. So it's very difficult for the population. And in all of that, we and also the humanitarian actors need to do their work. And the environment is very threatful. More and more the use of improvised explosive devices. And the explosive devices meant for the Malian armed forces, meant for the MINUSMA force, but also sometimes meant for other ethnicity militia, which is also a complicating factor, but also civil population runs into those type of devices. So it's very difficult and a very complicated situation, bringing many challenges. And I do want to refer to another complicating factor, which we've seen in the last year with an increasing influence. the misinformation and disinformation in the information domain. We have not referred to it, but it's further complicating the reality on the ground, absolutely. So those are, in a few sentences, the main challenges that we are facing. Now let me refer to a few gaps, so you will. First of all, the Malian government, the Malian security institutions, facing challenges of their limitations and so on, and they can't be everywhere as well. The police should have the primary responsibility in the villages and the Malian armed forces around it. That's basically a normal way of working that we see in a lot of countries, but they face a lot of limitations. Furthermore, every now and then we have these allegations of human rights violations, and whether it's right or wrong, the allegations are there and they are investigated, and sometimes we find out that Malian armed forces or their partner, not even talked about their private military company partner, have been involved in human rights violations, which is another complicating factor. And we all know, and we've said it this morning, the primary responsibility is with the host nation and its institutions. And we come into play if they are not able to do it, if they're not willing to do it, or in the worst case, if they are violating human rights. So it's a very complicated situation. But it is clear that security presence in itself does help. You know, where MINUSMA force is, we make a difference. Same for where the Malian armed forces are, they make a difference. And in terms of gap, the coordination amongst all the military players can be improved. Yes, absolutely. A lot is going well, but it can be further improved. And in this type of environment, we would like to be more predictive, to have better early warning, to identify early on the areas where things might go wrong and where presence could make a difference. And I think that is an aspect that we share the same interest, we as military actors and the humanitarian actors. Do you want me to move into some of the best practices as well? Really shortly. That brings me to a point, and I said that we have a kind of common interest as well. We have a common interest in protection of civilians. We have a common interest in trying to be more predictive, I think, and we both are facing the same complexity. So the better we can coordinate and help, the better it is for the situation and for the people and the population on the ground. And if you talk about cooperation or interoperability, so you will, there are three elements in it. There's the human dimension, which is basically, do we know each other well enough? Do we understand where we are coming from? There's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes amongst the military about the humanitarian actors. Yeah, they don't want to cooperate, or they have their demands, etc., but also the other way around. We need to get over it, and the only way to do it is to get to know each other. A good example in Mali is that UNOCHA has a course that basically meets that need. Now, it's not solved with just one course, but it is a way to get to know each other better and know each other's limitations and possibilities. Another element, apart from the human dimension, is the procedural dimension. Can we get to kind of common ways of working through which we can help one another? In Mali, we have a standing operating procedure coordinated between UNOCHA and the military force on how we do our business, how we coordinate. And we coordinate at the central level in Bamako, but we coordinate also at the regional level. And the regional level coordination is the most important, because that is about, you know, coordinating the activities, exchanging information, and so on and so on. And the third element is the technical piece. You know, in the military domain, you know, finding technical ways and means to share information. That is in this context the least important, I would say. The most important and often the most ignored, I always say, is the human dimension. Do we know each other well enough, and do we understand each other well enough? So bottom line, a lot is indeed going well. There's a lot of best practices, but there's still room for improvement, and it needs continuous attention on a daily basis. Don't have the idea that it's fixed with an SOP or with a course. It needs daily attention, and it requires leadership, because leadership is setting the tone. I will keep it to that, also considering the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General, for all of those important insights. Unpredictability is clearly an important element to keep in mind, but also the human dimension. It's lovely that that's been brought out so clearly. And there, of course, it resonates with the call for dialogue, which we heard throughout as well. But I do think this human dimension can often be forgotten, so thank you for bringing that out. Let's move on to our last but not least speaker from civil society, also able to speak to the Sahel region, Vianney Bissi-Moi. Maybe you could, from your point of view, share some of your experience when you look at cooperation between the UN and the EU peace actors and the humanitarian community. Is there room for working in more complementarity? How does their cooperation affect you in your work? Could there be more effective protection of civilians? How can the EU and the UN make a difference on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a lot of questions. I'll do my best to try to focus on examples. And I will start with an anecdote. I was telling my colleague that one day I was going to meet with a colonel in the Sahel, and we had a very good meeting. Right after the meeting, he was going to a SIM card meeting, and he changed his face. And I tell him, what happened? He says, I'm wearing my angry face. I was like, why? He said, I need to go to this SIM card meeting, and I need to be angry so that humanitarian actors will not tell the government what to do. I can use the same anecdote from humanitarian people who are going also to a SIM card meeting with a lot of restrictions that in front of them, security and defense forces doesn't understand their mandate, their missions, and how humanitarian action work. And I think it's important here when we talk about SIM card to really understand what we mean by it. And in my understanding, SIM card is more than coordination. It's how UN and EU peace actors, humanitarian actors, UN and peace actors partners who are security and defense forces, including local actors, come together and how they understand civilians' need and how together they respond to it. There is a co-creation effort that both sides should do. My analysis is that often many humanitarian actors doesn't understand how security and defense forces operate, how they function, and what kind of challenges they are facing when it comes to protection of civilians or when it comes to humanitarian action. And I think there is a gap there, and EU and UN actors should use that opportunity to create opportunities for humanitarian actors to better understand security and defense forces, how they work, how they function. And on the other hand, it's important to work with security and defense forces to help them understanding the humanitarian action and humanitarian principle. This can be done through creating relationship, through reinforcing trust, and we should go beyond formal opportunities and try using informal opportunities to create relationships so that each actor will understand each other better. Another one, I think it's about communication. I think we mentioned communication here. It is important that all those actors come together with a kind of joint communication strategy that clarify the role and responsibility, mission and mandate of each actor. And when it's come to humanitarian response to the crisis, what is some action they can do together and what is specific to each actor. And it's important to use emerging communication tools, including giving opportunities for communities to provide feedback on role and responsibility of those different actors. We also speak about local humanitarian actors. I think for us to have SIM card being efficient, it's important that local humanitarian actors also be part of the process. They should be present and they should be active. And I think it's important because it then puts security forces in front of their own citizens when it comes to discussing access and humanitarian responses. I will then try to speak about the protection of civilians and some lessons learned that our different program in different theater can share. One of them is advancing civilian harm mitigation. civilian harm mitigation is understood as all means that an armed actor can put in place to prevent, minimize, and respond to civilian harm that happen in each operational area. And I think EU and UN actors should really support regional and local security and defense forces to really put civilian harm mitigation as one of their key aspects as they are providing security responses to different threats. And that requires for those security forces to put in place some civilian harm tracking capacities. I can share here example with like the G5 and the MISAD, the AMISOM and their CCTARC, the Ukrainian army with the CCTM, which are mechanisms that help them to systematically identify, track, analyze, and respond to any harm that happen in the operational area. And linked to that, UN and EU should really encourage their partners at national and regional level to do amends when there are civilian casualties. In many cases, when there are civilian casualties, we hope that there could be a kind of legal process. But we know that in the conflict setting, it takes a lot of time, and sometimes it will never happen. So paying amends, it's an opportunity for government, state actors, and their partners to really recognize the harm that has been done to civilians and to provide in-kind or financial assistance to people who were affected. The other one, again, is communication. If you look at the Sahel, you will see many people in villages are seeing a lot of security people present. And they don't really do the difference between AU mission, UN mission, G5 Sahel mission, international presence, the private sector companies. They don't understand who is doing what. So it's important that by developing communication, we clarify each actor's role, responsibility, mandate, and as we said, what community can expect from those different actors. And finally, I will speak of community engagement, which is linked to that communication. How far those different actors enter into dialogue with communities to understanding their needs and to really be able to understand what are community best practices for their own protection and to push for them. There's a lot to speak. We can speak about local militias and VDP, but hope we can have some question and discuss on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vianney, for those very important points. And I think in particular to remind us that for the people on the ground, it's not really clear who is who and therefore who does what and so forth. I think it's something that we easily forget. For us, it's so easy to see the difference between the actors. And maybe we see it too much sometimes from above. And by above, I mean headquarters. So very important to remember that. Also, the regional aspect, I think, was brought out now clearly, and the importance of also making sure the national forces can play a role. But now we have about 20 minutes for questions, even less. Again, you can use the Slido. Studio is our room. Otherwise, I'd be really happy to take a couple of questions from the room. Any volunteers? And I believe there's microphones that will be given to the person speaking, or? Yes, there's the microphone. Okay, so we have a question over there. Please introduce yourself briefly and go ahead.
Hi, my name is Fabian Nolde from the German NGO HELP. I am coordinating programs in South Sudan and in Mali. And I have teams of about 200 employees in each country. And so I was wondering about the question of capability, because sometimes, and that also came a little bit short maybe, the state is also a perpetrator in a conflict. And peacekeeping missions are often in these settings. If you look at South Sudan, like what can be done to improve that? I'm wondering about things like air capabilities that are lacking in South Sudan, for example. And the South Sudanese military effectively has the air capabilities and not the UN mission. And the UN mission, yeah, what are they supposed to do if something happens then, you know? So maybe that's a question. Yeah, that would be interesting to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple. That ties in with one of the questions online a little bit, I think. How about support countries? How to support countries in protection of civilian implementation? So let's try and join a few things together. Another question here, the lady in the front.
Hello, I'm Elena Ranchal. I'm the Director of International Operations from Médecins du Monde France. In December, last December, one of our staff was killed by a soldier in a military basis in Nigeria. So how is it possible to move forward in order to build some confidence when we have this kind of events, and that 3 months later, after that, we don't have any report for the military and for the army? So how can we move forward?
Thank you very much. An important question, trust building after a lethal incident. One more in the room, and then I think here. I didn't see, please. There, yes, the light is so bright. Go on.
Thank you very much. I'm Pauline Warnot, Senior Legal Advisor at the ICRC delegation here based in Brussels. Thank you, Ms. Adam Worsenou, for your very interesting presentation based on your extensive experience. I had a question regarding the reference that you made to the fact that humanitarian principles seems to be blurred at the moment, and our understanding at the ICRC is that they are rather misunderstood, and it can be based on many things that we see in current armed conflict, including an increasing politizations of such conflict, but also with information, as was referred to by General. So my question is here, how do we, based on your experience and your expertise, how do you see it would be best implemented in the field? How could those principles be better understood by the states, by the parties, by the belligerents, or by also the civilian population, or also by the media, knowing that humanitarian actors would abide by those principles? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that also goes hand in hand with the question online about the militarization of humanitarian aid. So those two very easy questions come together. Anybody else before we turn back? Yes, there's a gentleman in the middle.
I'm Pierre Scotto, based in Dakar for ECHO, as the head of regional office for West and Central Africa. One question on SIM-Cord and escort. One of the basic principles of SIM-Cord is the use of armed escort as a last resort, as we know it. And we always have this kind of systemic issues, like SIM-Cord teams on the ground led by OCHA do push for this principle. And then at the same time, we've got UNDSS who is imposing escort on UN agencies. So this seems to be a very, let's say, spread out issue and very systemic, and I'm wondering if we could not address it by kind of fixing it at UNDSS level for once. Thanks.
Thank you. Quite a concrete question there. I think if there's no urgent burning... Okay, let's do one more. You've been so good at having quick questions, so go on. Then we'll turn back to the speakers.
Good morning, Sandra Levuzuto from WFP, Head of Access Unit and Conflict Sensitive. My question is to OCHA, but also to the panelists, and thank you very much for the presentation regarding misinformation and disinformation. We've seen that in Sahel lately, and I think we are always reactive. How we can be more proactive in addressing those issues and working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very diligent audience, being so short and actual questions rather than clever comments, so that's very nice. We also have a question online specifically for our EAS colleague about the integrating protection of civilians into the EU integrated approach, if you're able to elaborate on that. but otherwise I think we've more or less covered also some of these questions online. So we'll have about 2 minutes per speaker now to try and address the questions that you think are relevant to yourself. I allow you to choose that, and then I'll wrap up very quickly, and that should take us to the end. Thanks a lot for all those very good questions. Should we start with Cosmin maybe at the end today, or now?
All right. Thank you very much. Can I choose some of the questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Please do, otherwise.
Can I start with the disinformation, because I think it's really extremely important that we address this. So there are 2 aspects on disinformation when it comes to CSDP European missions and operations. First is that we've seen cases where the missions and operations themselves were the target of disinformation. This is one aspect, and with very concrete examples. And then it's the role of the missions and operations actually to speak more about their activities and to make sure that actually the general public understands. Because the logic of a mission or operation is to focus on the governmental structures, to train them, to equip them, to make sure that the mandate is implemented. That's the main focus of a European mission or operation. Now what we are trying to do is to equip a little bit missions and operations with this capability to deal with this information. It's something that we do have a capacity inside the house called Stratcom. So this is a new trend, and you will see in new theaters that missions would actually be much more proactive on that front. There was also a question, the first question on capabilities. Here, obviously, of course, we would like to help partners as much as possible, but there is a wider picture. If you have Wagner elements, I mean, obviously, you put into question the whole operation there, and this is what we are doing. So I want to be very clear on that if you have a risk like that, you cannot actually continue with the business as usual. So there is an element very clear in that regard. And then on the question online on the integrated approach, I mean, the integrated approach to crisis and conflict, basically the idea is to put at work all the instruments that the EU has in order to make sure that they not only that we coordinate, but the outcome, the overall outcome is much better than by working individually. This is the main logic, and the complexity here is that basically instruments, the governance and the business models are not the same. Because of institutional concerns, but also because of how the policies were developed. You have a program which is run by the European Commission, which has a completely different logic from a military operation. The clear chain of command. So that's and what we do. We first make sure that we talk before we actually intervene, and then we monitor the interventions to make sure that actually we don't create more problems than finding solutions. And at the end, we look actually to see if we can increase the complementarity level. That's one. Or this is new, if we can have missions and operations actually taking a part of the action that is usually done by other instruments. That's something new. It's a project cell, for example, very impactful project, small, not a lot of, but it's a new way of trying to better implement the mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cosmin. And I'm reassured when I also understand that the bulking up of the EAS Stratcom is both about understanding perceptions and shaping perceptions. I think this is a welcome change, or evolution, rather. Let's move on to Vienna. Let's go this way now and on the way back. Please, 2 minutes. We're going to run over, I'm sorry. I hope it's lunch after, yes? Yeah, okay, good. Go.
Thank you. So speaking about capacity building, I think it's important that the training that is provided to to different national and regional forces by the EU and UN systematically include civilian presence and civilian needs. We don't see that often happening, and this should be beyond IHL training. I'll give you an example. If you want to train a soldier on firing, or if you want to do a kind of exercise on taking a village, or on conducting a raid, how far are you including in those exercises and in those training civilian presence and civilian needs, so that you create a particular civilian reflex among security and defense forces? And how far in existing military curriculum, from the beginning, civilians' need and civilian presence is included? And that can be done through different military centers, and it's important to make sure that at the very beginning level, POC is systematically integrated, and it goes beyond training on IHL. The other one is about this very bad incident that happened. And I think it's important that the partners of local and national actors remain telling them that when it comes to POC and civilian harm mitigation, communicating on a harm is a good thing. It even helps to reduce rumor, and it even cultivates trust. When there is harm that happened to civilians, we try to see many local actors try not to speak about it, or be fearing like to be understood by different actors. But this is not helping all their effort. And I think EU and UN, in their partnership and interaction, should really, while engaging with different government and security forces, make sure that they communicate regularly on harm and what is happening when there is investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Extremely important. General, please move ahead.
Let me reflect on a few things. Maybe first related to the question of the militarization, and also related to the question on armed escort. I think the risk is there, but it's something that we need to be cautious of on both sides. And this also requires having the dialogue in the field, you know, looking at the circumstances, exchanging thoughts, looking at potential second and third order effects, and then identify the best way to do something and how we can help one another. And if you would ask me, it is always the humanitarian side, so to say, that should ask us. I'm not the one to say, hey, you need an armed escort. It's always them to ask for it, and we're willing to do it. And in the how, there's always a variety. But most important is it requires the dialogue in the field, looking at the circumstances, what is the priority, what needs to be done. And on both sides, we need to be cautious of the risk indeed. Related to the misinformation and the disinformation, it is important there are two sides of it. One side is the understanding side. Do we have an understanding of what is ongoing? Where is it coming from? Who are the actors behind the scenes? And then the other side is how to counter it, or how to deal with it, and making sure that we don't have negative effects from it. That is one thing. And on the own side, so to say, the action side, there's always one thing, at least that's one of my principles. Always be ready to communicate about your activities, and try to be the first with the truth. Don't give other actors the opportunity, you know, don't give them time to come up with a different message. Try to be the first with the truth. And on the military side, I say that, you know, thinking about the information domain is part of our way of operating. It is the unfortunate reality in the world that we're living in right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General. Edem?
Thanks a lot. A few quick reflections, and this requires a lot of time, but we don't have it as we know. The first one, I think one issue that didn't come up, and if I may talk about that a little bit, is gender. I alluded to the fact that we have a lot of needs that are, you know, women and children, and yet, look at this room, that this topic is a lot of, you know, it's a specific male-dominated area, and we need to call out more women in the area of peace and security, as well as humanitarian civil military coordination. I just wanted to throw that out there. The questions on clear lines of, you know, the humanitarian principles that are blurred, I think it's not easy, it's not black and white, but it's certainly about continued and constant dialogue and communication that has been touched on by all the colleagues and the fellow panelists here. The emphasis on what we cannot accept. I have to throw one challenge out to all of us. Different agencies, funds and programs, different entities have different interests. We are not always speaking with a common voice. So some of us go in there pushing principles, and others, let's be honest, throw principles out of the window. So we're really pushing ourselves as humanitarians and as, in this field is necessary. The last point is on armed escorts. You're right, 100% we believe in the last resort, but the problem is often it's the first resort. So I think we, at the Civil Military Coordination dialogue conversations we have at the Humanitarian Networks and Partnership Weeks, which will start in April in Geneva, we push a lot the boundaries on what the realities are in the humanitarian context that we live in and how we can change those realities. We do have this problem all the time. And once you go down the armed escort route, you cannot claw back at all. And that's the problem that we're facing. But indeed, brilliant questions and lots to cover, but I've just kept it short. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, so insightful. Rory, please.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief, and maybe I'll address the question from our colleague in Help International. I think most of the other points were taken, and it's a very good question. South Sudan is a massive terrain, huge, colossal humanitarian needs, and a UN peacekeeping mission that is really overstretched in terms of what it needs to do. So one of the things that, in terms of the protection agenda, one of the things that we think about in peacekeeping is protection through projection. So in the sense of being able to cover and monitor a large area. But of course, as General Matthijssen will also be able to tell us, one of the challenges here, in order to do this, you need significant airlift. And one of the biggest capacity deficits in UN peacekeeping operations is airlift, getting airlift. So one practical way of supporting this protection agenda would be to have more airlift. And in this regard, the humanitarian community in this room have a role to play, because you are a very legitimate voice. And when the humanitarian community is talking to EU member states, are talking to donors, also making the case for more airlift to support a peacekeeping operation to do its protection work, your voice can count for a lot. So I would encourage you also to reflect on that. The other aspect is about early warning. As I mentioned, I think we all mentioned in our having early warning, which is also more difficult now because of the challenge of disinformation, which can cloud all of that discourse. But having early warning can really enable a peacekeeping operation to take some action or to undertake some pre-deployment or early deployment and so on. And in that regard, having regular conversations on the ground between peacekeeping operations or UN political operations and the humanitarian community is critical. And I worry sometimes that we leave this to the CivMil focal point in the humanitarian organization. So I think this needs to be everybody's business, not necessarily the CivMil focal point, to ensure that these early conversations take place, because the humanitarian community often has the most real-time information. Thanks a lot again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rory. Wow, extremely rich and so complementary, all these different interventions. In terms of summing up, I will do 3 headlines, and then I'm sure the organizers will do the rest. First, we hear across that we need a holistic and integrated approach. There's been no doubt about that this is more than CivMil coordination, and it's about multifaceted actors, multifaceted contexts, and it's about much more than physical protection. Also, number 2, the importance of management expectation through clarity, through transparency on roles, responsibilities, and the different mandates. Community engagement is key here, but also joint communication and two-way communication. 3, prevention and preemption, which requires early warning, adaptability, as well as monitoring, and to expect and be prepared for the unexpected. And not only information sharing, but also analysis sharing. And ownership of all of that in order to also have a big impact on prevention and preemption. Across all of these, we need to, thank you very much, underline inclusivity, gender equality, gender representation, as well as the importance of dialogue across all of these three areas, trust building, IHL, and do no harm. I'm sure the list is so much longer, but this is my attempt to, in 30 seconds, sum up, because we've gone over time. I'd like to thank Lydia and colleagues for pulling together this extremely useful panel with such complementarity between speakers, and for the speakers to speaking to the topic in such a focused manner, audience for great questions. Have a lovely lunch. Thank you.